It's kind of a usual day in America here, in that it's where I am right now. I'm in Connecticut. It's beautiful out. I'm looking out over this beautiful scenery, and I'm also looking at my computer, and my computer tells me that there was a mass shooting yesterday in California that claimed the lives of 9 people. That there's a law coming down the pike in Texas that basically said that anyone and everyone can carry a gun without any kind of permit or regulation or anything like that. And so this is kind of our reality here. And what was interesting for me as someone who studied guns and gun violence for quite a long time here, is that when I first got started in this field, like many people, I was drawn in the aftermath of when, and everybody can think about this for themselves. When did guns first come into your mind? For me, it was Trayvon Martin first, and kind of this idea of a stand your ground kind of shooting, that someone could just claim self-defense and basically murder someone. And then that was followed in the aftermath with all of the kind of horrific mass shootings that became kind of monikers in and of themselves. So Parkland and Sandy Hook and Las Vegas and you name it. I mean, we almost run out of places after a while. And what we see on one hand is this trajectory where, for better or worse, I remember, of course, Sandy Hook, 20 children between the ages of 6 and 7 and 6 staff members at a school are murdered. And it's a national reckoning. Parkland High School, it's a national reckoning. We're at a different moment in our history right now. But think about what happened yesterday when you heard about that there was a mass shooting at San Jose, and it was just kind of a feeling of helplessness, of resignation, of exhaustion. It was kind of the mood. And so part of the question is just, how did we get here? What are we going to do about it? And how can reasonable people come together? I'll say one last thing, then I'll introduce our great panelists, which is that I've spent a lot of time on all sides of this issue with millions of conversations. We did some conversations a while ago with some friends of mine who I work with who are staunchly pro Second Amendment. I did an interview with my friend Joe here, who probably has more AR-15s than many small towns around the world, and just kind of trying to think about how can we come together. And I think it's a hard question, right? I just think it's important to recognize up front that no one wants injury and death. No one wants to feel unsafe. Everybody wants to feel secure for themselves and their communities. But because of the frame of polarization around this issue, around guns, around politics, around the United States, it's frustrating. It's frustrating because we feel like we've lost the ability to talk to each other. And so, even things that are of kind of common purpose become places where conversations break down, not only because we don't know how to talk to each other, but because even when we talk to each other, what's the outcome going to be if the policy directions are just going to keep being, so polarized? And so to address these questions today, we have 2 excellent panelists. Let me just apologize. First of all, I am obviously not the stated host, but it's been my life fantasy to be the emergency fill-in host for like a weekend show or something. And so this is it. This is living my dream. I'm the fill-in host right now. And I'm excited about that. And I think between the 3 of us, because we've done a lot of work in this space, we're going to be able to kind of talk a lot about this. And what we'll do is we'll talk for about the next 35, 40 minutes, and then we'll have people kind of go back to small group discussions in the kind of millions of conversations model. So I'm delighted to introduce, first of all, Jason Dempsey, who's the founding member of the Veterans Advisory Group to support gun violence prevention with Everytown for Gun Safety, also works with Moms Demand Action, so 2 of the leading gun violence prevention organizations. He also serves as adjunct senior fellow with the Center for New America Security, where he hosts an ongoing series on race and the American military, sponsored by Millions. Jason, for people who don't know, and where have you been, spent 22 years as an infantry officer in the U.S. Army, serving airborne, Ranger, air assault, and mechanized infantry units. He deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan and served as a special assistant to the Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff. And we are also delighted to be joined by Justin McFarlin, who is an experienced aerospace and defense professional and Army vet with almost 2 decades of industry experience. He's also a founding member of Everytown for Gun Safety's Advisory Council, an NRA certified firearms instructor, and amateur gunsmith. As a gun owner who is passionate about the intersection of firearms and race, he has been featured in Time magazine, appeared in NBC News, and written in USA Today on the racial elements of gun violence and of gun ownership. Justin is also a National Security Fellow with the Truman National Security Project. So welcome to both of you. And I think what we'll do is we'll just start taking your temperature, if that's okay. So why don't we start with you, Justin? How you feeling about all this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like a here we go again type scenario. I mean, like you mentioned, it's something that's pervasive. It's something that happens continuously, and it's almost exhausting mentally and emotionally. Just as we kind of see this cycle of violence continue to perpetuate, month after month, week after week. I think you touched upon sort of Sandy Hook and Parkland as being sort of pivotal moments or moments that a reckoning. And for me, it's been almost sad and discouraging that even after Parkland, even after Sandy Hook, like even after these grievous incidents, we still really haven't seen much change in any of the kind of the policies or stances across the country. If anything, it's going the opposite direction, where guns, as you mentioned, the permitless carry is now on the docket. It's now something that they're considering in Texas, and I believe it's something that passed recently in Tennessee. So now we have more people, not just more guns out there, but more people who are able to just walk around, without any type of training, with any type of accountability, and just walking around with guns on our streets, which, for me as a gun owner, makes me fearful. I mean, I even outside of the Army, I had a lot of training with weapons, and I think that it's a lot of responsibility that comes with owning firearms that many gun owners don't fully appreciate. And I think that legislation like what we've seen recently, and the lack of action from our local and national politicians on this topic is frustrating and scary to me personally.
Well, let's hold on. So much important in that comment. I mean, one important thing in that comment before I hand it over to Jason is just to say, where do gun owners turn, right? Where do responsible gun owners turn, people who are trained? And I'll just tell you, and this is really a huge surprise, there's tons of data that shows that the lack of handgun training correlates with shooting your gun more. and so there's everyday examples like people probably remember, I think it was like at Walmart or something, a year ago, somebody was shoplifting, the security ran after him, a gun owner just whipped out, started firing around they thought they were going to be a good guy with a gun. They had no gun training. They just bought a gun and they just was like shooting around the parking lot. And that kind of thing happens a lot. But there also are examples from like the Albuquerque police scandal of about 5 years ago, where it turned out the police were getting zero firearms training. They just gave people guns and were like, go out there and uphold the law. And it turned out they were 50% more likely than police anywhere else in the country to discharge their weapons. And believe it or not, who was getting shot? It was persons of color and persons with mental illness. Half the people who were shot had a diagnosable mental illness also. And so there's tons of data. And in fact, I can't think of one study that says that lack of handgun training makes you a safer gun owner. I would love to see that study. I just haven't seen it. And so there is a sense of frustration. Let's bring in Jason and take his temperature, and then we'll come back to some of these things. But Jason, what's your sense of all this?
It's a little bit of despair because we are in a destructive cycle, right? We're in this unvirtuous circle where you can't divorce gun violence from the overall state of American political discourse. And where we are is we're stuck on the modes of fear and fantasy, and there's no in between. And so when you talk about the conversation as this all goes along, we say, man, how can this happen again and again and again? What we're talking about are two separate realities, two separate interpretations. When we see stuff like this and we say, man, we need to stop or need to think about the scourge of gun violence. What we don't realize, though, is every time there's a shooting, that's not the takeaway from people who are already living in fear, and for people who get their sense of empowerment by living through fantasies of being a white knight and the person who saves the day in a Walmart parking lot. And we have to, somehow we have to break the cycle of that conversation, because it just doesn't work. It hasn't worked for 20 years. It's not going to work in the future, because more violence, more fear, more fantasy solutions. So we're not in a great spot, but doing what we've been doing isn't going to get us out of this spot.
And so let me ask both of you, when is the right time to have this conversation? And I say this as a kind of complicated question, because on one hand, there's often an assumption. I mean, think about our gun violence prevention movement, for example. It's named after Newtown. It's named after Sandy Hook. It's named after, the gun violence prevention movement takes shape in the aftermath of mass shootings, of not just mass shootings, but high profile mass shootings. And we're going to complicate that in a minute here. But is that the right time to be having the conversation, or did we go down the wrong path in doing that? And the reason I say that is because there's a lot of data that says that after mass shootings, people become more polarized. I mean, we've just seen with Atlanta and Boulder, for example, that everybody's like, okay, enough is enough. And then they set the record for most background checks and most gun sales 2 weeks in a row after those mass shootings. So people who are fearful or who feel like guns are the answer to things become more pro-gun, and people who support gun control after mass shootings become more supportive of some kind of regulation. And so, is the aftermath of a mass shooting the right time to be having this conversation, or did we go down the wrong path by framing this conversation so deeply in a kind of existential moment that was surprisingly polarizing? Jason, I'll start with you.
Well, it's a trick question, right? Because it's impossible to have the conversation now when it's not in the aftermath of a mass shooting, right? I mean, there's one every week. So we just have, so one, we have to realize that, it's weird how none of them, it's almost shocking. Like, how many people would you have to kill, and in what way would you have to kill them to even be seen as unique in the news cycle? And that's a horrifying thought to think of, right? If you just think about how many folks got shot at that concert in Vegas, and that really didn't make any difference, let alone, the killings of all the children, in Sandy Hook. I think the challenge is we have to get out of a binary mode here, and obviously in the wake of a mass shooting, there's fear of they're going to seize guns. I won't be able to get a gun anymore, so I need to go buy one now. And it's a great marketing tool, unfortunately, for the gun industry. Somehow we have to get around that and get to the day-to-day conversations. And I think for those who haven't seen it, John didn't talk about himself, but Dying of Whiteness, there's a great book, and John does a whole section on here. And a lot of it's about risk, right? Assessing, if we actually sat down and said, gee, what are the odds of me stepping into the breach and saving a bunch of kids from a mass shooting versus what are the odds that my gun might be picked up by a toddler who shoots somebody accidentally, or might be used in an incident of domestic violence, or might be used in a bar fight, or just as we saw in DC, within the last 48 hours, a man jumped out of his car and shot a woman just because she tried to merge with him. Right? Those are the much more common things. And so I think we need to get to that. And I'll let Justin talk through some of the stuff that we've been trying to push, at least by adding a veteran voice to all this. It's not about the emergency. It's not about the mass shooting. It's about, if you're really going to respect this tool, then you have to understand that treating it properly requires training, it requires safety, and it requires accountability.
Justin?
Yeah, 100% agree with Jason. And a couple of things I want to touch on. First, any time is a good time to talk about gun violence prevention in my mind. I don't think there's ever a bad time, because I think a lot of times we, in some ways, almost lose fact of the loss of life involved in each killing, not just mass killings, but each incident of gun violence. And that loss of life impacts that person, obviously, but then impacts their family, their friends, and it's a ripple effect into the community. And that's just from one death, let alone, the countless deaths that are occurring every day, day in and day out. I think it's 100 deaths per day are by guns. 66 of those are by suicide. So I think that, mass shootings are terrible. They're horrible, and we have to find ways to stop them. But as Jason said, there's people dying every day from gun violence and from suicide. And unless we're continuously having that conversation, continuously making people aware, continuously pushing and fighting and advocating, that people are going to continue to die. And for me, I feel like if I have one conversation that saves one life, that's worth it. And because of that ripple effect and the impact that it has on all the lives around it.
And so this is really a question for all of us. What can be done? And I'll say this as a caveat. Because you're both involved in the gun violence prevention movement, I'll start there, and I'll tell you why I think this is a complicated question. Number one is we're losing. I mean, by any measure, we're getting our butts kicked. There's a case before the Supreme Court in the fall that's going to pretty much overturn the ability of any city or state to set its own gun policy for the most part. So get ready for a lot more of what's happening in states like Texas to happen in other places, including places that don't want it. The way I'm thinking about this case in the Supreme Court is like if you were in Alabama right before Roe versus Wade, and you're like, well, that might work in New York, but there's no way I'm going to allow abortion here. And then Roe versus Wade passes, and that's like, nope, sorry, dude, you got to abide by the law of the land. And we're going to get that in reverse, I think, with this Supreme Court case, where basically regulating people's ability to carry guns outside their house in parts of the country that haven't done it, it's going to be much more difficult. So partially, there's just going to be a lot more gun ownership, I think, in a way. And for me, and this is the kind of the provocation. We've built the gun violence prevention movement around shooting, around different kinds of shooting. And you guys are both right to point out that mass shootings get the news. That's when we're paying attention to this, even though everyday shootings are much more common. But there's nothing about the meaning of gun ownership, really. I mean, in a way, what does it mean to carry a gun? I'm thinking of Justin's opening comment here, that carrying a gun is a responsibility, things like that. But you know what I mean? Like, in a way, is that where the gun violence prevention movement is going to have to go because of this? And the other, of course, complicating factor is we've just gone through this pandemic, and it's been the greatest bonanza for gun sales in the history of, ant farms. I mean, it's crazy, but in the beginning of the pandemic, it's like the magic word. There's a shortage. Somebody's going to take away your gun. And then people's grandparents ran out to get guns, people's, kids ran out to get, anybody could get a gun because a gun became like Purell and toilet paper. And so we're going to have more guns, many more guns after this pandemic. And also looser gun laws federally across the country, not just state by state. And so I guess really that's the question. And then I want to make sure we get to race before we turn back to policy. But just in terms of that, what happens, what's the role of the gun violence prevention movement in the face of what's happening? And why don't we start with Jason?
Well, I think we're going to learn a lesson that people learned previously. You always think that the other side, grass on the other side's greener. You think that, well, things must have been different back in the day. And you don't realize why people put in laws. You understand that there's, I sense some friction and I can't have a gun with me wherever I go. Let's just get rid of that friction without thinking about, well, what were the community and cultural learnings that led us all to say, hey, you know what? If I'm going to go out drinking with my buddies and I'm going to a neighborhood bar, how about we all just agree not to carry guns? Because we've all been in bars. We all know what stupid things happen. And so for me, it's this idea we have to get back to, guys, it's not about fundamental freedoms. It's not about, and Michael Mover making a point, carrying a gun in a bar is illegal in most states, not all of them. And oh, by the way, from what John's saying, it's going to be harder and harder to make guns illegal for carry in any place you want to go, whether it's a school, whether it's a business, no matter where you want to go. So if there are no right, limitations for when and how you can carry your gun, and everybody's got it, it's what it is. It undercuts the very premise of democracy. It undercuts the very premise of us agreeing how we're going to live together. Right? It suggests such an atomized society, which is where we're going with the way people are looking at race and everything else, that we think that the only solution is not government. It's not talking to our fellow community leaders. It's not agreeing, hey guys, let's all be cool here. Not everybody needs a gun in their glove compartment. Let's let the police handle minor shoplifting at Walmart and not start a shootout because somebody's walking out with some extra Purell. So I think the problem is we're going to learn just how devastating what kind of devastating tool a weapon can be in normal life. And I think we may not get a correction that goes all the way back to full sanity, but we're going to see at least maybe some movement to say, all right, letting 18-year-old boys carry guns on their hips anywhere and everywhere they wanted to go, maybe not a good idea.
Well, let me just play devil's advocate on that before we hand it back to Justin to solve all these problems for us. But I mean, states that have had that, I mean, what kind of come to reckoning moment would you need more than the gun violence rates in places like Missouri, for example, places that lowered the carry age to 18 years old, and saw actually the skyrocketing rates of shootings between 18 to 21-year-olds, not just gun violence, but gun suicide also, fastest growing groups. And those states didn't have a let's find a middle ground moment. They had a let's make guns easier and easier moment. So Jason, wouldn't that notion of awakening be complicated by what we've seen in some states?
It is. And unfortunately, we're not drawing it's going to be tough. And maybe the crux of it will be, when do you fear, the normal accidents? When do you look at them? And I think what we'll talk about here in the second half of this discussion is getting at, just how do you better gauge risk, right? Because all these open carry laws that are starting to come that do indeed propose lowering the age of carry to 18 for anybody, right? When those things come to pass, and at some places where they already have, right, we're seeing this violence. I think, and what you talk about greatly in your book is, it's okay, we accept, right, minor shootouts. We accept folks, we accept toddlers getting shot with a gun. Why do we do that? Because apparently there's a fear of something bigger that's even worse. And we can talk about government overreach, and you can talk about race, you can talk about terrorism. I think there's something wrong with our psyche right now that suggests we're going to take an unacceptable amount of accidents, death, and disruption because we've created, again, this fantasy of all the things that might threaten us. And carrying a gun makes us feel better about that, facing down that fantasy, whether or not it's real.
Justin, you buy it?
I think that element's spot on. So I do agree with that. And I think you pointed this out, Johnathan, I don't think there's going to be a come to Jesus moment. I don't think, at a certain point, at a certain proliferation of guns, or there'll be a kind of a pendulum swing the other way. I'm not so sure about that. And I think, part of it is what you guys were talking about just now in the racial element. And I'll perfect segue into kind of our next piece, talking about race. But personally, I just think that guns are almost like a proxy for power for the white male, and they're holding on to that power, no matter what class they are, because it's that fear of the other. It's the fear that they're losing grips on the power, that others will have not just more than them, but the same as them, and that equality. And I think that's really not going to, I don't have a solution for it, because I just don't think it's going to go away that easily. Because as you talked about in your book, Johnathan, people are not voting, people are not acting in their own interests in many cases in this regard. And then I just want to say one last thing on risks. I think there's definitely a risk element here, and there's also a racial element with that risk. So I've written a little bit around open carry and concealed carry. And I've got my concealed carry license here in Florida, as well as I've had it in other states. But I will tell you, I have not concealed carry in probably 4 to 5 years now. But it's that risk that Jason touched on. I'm more afraid of a police officer or a do-gooder shooting me because they might see, the back of a pistol on my shirt, or as I'm, reaching for my wallet, my shirt might flip up, or something like that, and miscommunication, whatever it might be, and I die because I have a weapon on me. So that risk that you're talking about, Jason, it's not just the risk of owning a weapon, it's also the risk of carrying the weapon, and then that risk is different depending on what you look like.
And let's think about that in historical perspective, right? Because we know, I mean, there are two historical points that might be interesting to think about as we think about race in this conversation. One, of course, is the racial history of gun control. Long history in this country of white gun ownership. The Ku Klux Klan Night Riders were enforcing white gun ownership. What were called black codes, decades before that. After the Civil War, only the black veterans got disarmed. You name it, all the way back to pre-colonial America. Carrying a gun has been a mark of white privilege. Then in 1965, 66, 67, 68, Huey Newton and Stokely Carmichael and Rat Brown and other people started saying, Second Amendment applies to me also. And Malcolm X in that famous staged image of him standing by the window with the rifle. But basically what we're saying is the Constitution should apply to everybody. And at that moment, society was like, wait a minute, sorry about that. And that's when the Gun Control Act of 1968 came out. That was an act that had the support of the National Rifle Association, the American Medical Association. Sorry, Bobby. And any other association you can think of. And so there was a moment where when black men particularly started saying Second Amendment applies to me, all of a sudden people found gun control. That's the 1960s. A second moment I think that's important is when we started having open carry, particularly of long rifles. And all of a sudden, all these white freedom patriots started walking around Chipotle and, Target and stuff with their, don't ever carry a gun the way these guys were doing it. They clearly didn't know what they were doing, but they would carry their strapped long guns, walking around buying burritos and stuff. But the minute, black gun owners in places like Dallas would walk in, there's a case in a Walmart, actually, a lot of shit happens in Walmart, it seems like. But he walked in with a holstered gun and got tackled and shot. And there's a zillion examples of that gun owners who were black were seen as threats. And so there's this divide between the white patriot and the black criminal or thug or something like that, that just kind of leaves us at a particular crossroads. And so I guess the question really that is on my mind is this a different moment right now? Because we're going to let anybody and everybody buy and carry a gun. Is this a moment where we change the racial history of gun ownership because it's just going to be so useful? And I mean, I'll show you guys my texts and tweets I get sometimes, but after every mass shooting, all my gun owner friends are like, if those kids in Sandy Hook just would have had weapons, that guy never would have. I mean, it's like that level of like ridiculous about this fantasy. But
Yeah.
if guns become much more pervasive, will it change the racial narrative here? Or are we always going to live in a racist society? Justin.
I don't have an answer to that, but what I will say, both anecdotally and statistically, there has been a very large uptick in gun ownership within the African American community over the past year or so. Some of that is associated with COVID, just like other gun upticks, but then also there is definitely a racial element of it where Black people know that the majority of guns are in white hands. They realize that, and I think there's a realization that, okay, well, if this is the right that we have, we need to start exercising it ourselves as well. And I think one of the things that I have been very intentional about is because we touched on this, the influx of new weapons into new owners, without training or anything of that nature, is really trying to figure out, okay, how can, as people are buying these weapons, how can I make sure that they are trained and not posing a danger to themselves or to others? Because again, anytime you introduce weapons into a house, there's a certain element of risk involved. So just trying to make sure that, if we are making this decision, and owning a firearm is a very personal decision, if someone chooses to do that, how can they do it in the most safest way possible? But excuse me, it is definitely interesting to see kind of that racial, I'm not gonna say divide, but there's definitely, well, I'll say a racial divide within gun owners, because I think that there's also an element of not open hostility towards Black gun owners, but it's when you walk into a gun shop as a Black man, it's like, okay, well, what are you doing here? Type of thing. So I think, as these laws continue to be passed, as more guns are out on the streets, as people of all colors, shapes, and sizes are continuing to buy them more, I don't think necessarily it's going to cause a dramatic change, as you were alluding to before, in kind of the perceptions as it did in the 60s. Yeah, so I don't think it's gonna make too big of a difference. My personal hope is just to make sure that, as people are doing this, it's as safe as possible, because again, it's just, every life is precious, and we're just not really focused on that element as much when we have these types of conversations, both at a high level, but then also individually. And so I'll say one last thing before I give you one more, let you go back to your question. One of the things I like to do when I'm talking to people, especially about guns and weapons, is try to tell stories and talk to people about the impact that it has on their lives, the impact that it can have on other people's lives. Because I think a lot of people, as you mentioned, get very esoteric and thinking about, okay, well, I'm going to this because I think something big is going to happen. The government's going to do this, or a bad guy's going to do that. But they don't really think about, okay, well, what happens if my daughter discovers it? What happens if I don't have it locked up securely, and my son is playing with it or wants to show it off to his friends? And I think that a lot of times that's kind of what we really need to try to get to with some people. I'm trying to be optimistic when I talk about this, but common sense type of things. As Jason mentioned, training, safety, accountability. How can you argue against training? How can you argue against being safe? And just trying to, with responsible gun owners and those new gun owners, trying to have those conversations.
I love that. And I actually want you guys to be in charge of all this. I'd feel much safer, honestly. But I am going to push back on it a little bit before I hand it back to Jason, and just say that this is exactly what's not happening, right? I mean, I think you're right that that's what should happen, but it's exactly what not happening. And I'll just say that Black gun owners have been a fantasy of the NRA. Now, for people, let's not make any mistake here. The NRA, they're representing the gun sellers, right? They're a lobby for gun manufacturers. They're not representing gun owners. And so this idea of the responsible gun owner, that's what they used to be before the so-called new way of the NRA in the 1960s. But now the aim is they're arms dealers. They want to sell as many guns as possible. And so they've had the number of the white man for quite a while here. Let's be honest. If you start telling people this is government intrusion in your life, the government's going to take away your liberty, and Black people are going to cut in front of you in line and take your resources. Those three things, well, that's a great way to sell guns to many white people in this country. But Black populations have been historically resistant to being gun owners for a couple of reasons. One, guns didn't mean what they did in white communities because of the history of racist gun ownership and gun control. And also people lived in places where they'd seen the devastating effects of just everyday gun violence. Like they'd had Jason's come to Jesus movement, and they were like, let's get this out of our neighborhood. But the NRA tried all these totally fake things. They had a fake spokesperson, Colin Noir, they used to hire. He was on NRA television for a long time, urban Black gun enthusiast, to try to get more Black people to get guns. It didn't work at all, zero. Until about 2 years ago, when they realized that one of the narratives they could use is the police aren't going to protect you, so you better be prepared, right? Which turned out to be a great marketing strategy, because it taps into real world, real concerns, real anxieties. And so they're saying basically you need a gun with you at all times because of this. And if they find that hook of what this is, I mean, for women, it's, for people who know this history, have a gun in your purse because you might get date raped and all this. Like, they play to people's worst fantasy, and then it's like, oh, I don't want to be caught without a gun at that moment. And so I guess, considering the role of that anxiety, and I'll go to you, Jason, how do you push back on that, right? Because it's basically like, insert your worst fear here. Gun, it's like Mad Libs. Gun is the noun that fills in that Mad Libs, and then whatever. So
it's a generalized sense of helplessness and ineffectiveness. And I think, to your point, the two most amusing anecdotes, or the saddest anecdotes of the last 20 years. One, when rumors would spread that ISIS wants to attack where my relatives are from, say Rupert, Idaho, right? Someplace that's completely off the grid, would require folks to drive days to get to, and that actually has nothing worth blowing up unless you hate potatoes. And we saw the same thing in the run up to the election, especially during the protests during the summer, where entire towns were mobilized because somebody said, hey, somebody from DHS said a bus full of Antifa is coming to this rural small town. And there's no greater symbol of impotence, I don't think, than a bunch of rural folks thinking, I've got to get my gun together to protect my small town. And it's a reflection of their sense of disenchantment and ineffectiveness, I think, that they can't, one, they don't understand how the world works. And two, they've created these giant fantasies by which they can pick up a gun and answer that threat, versus doing the hard work of actually being engaged in politics. And so it's really hard to disentangle a lot of this. And I think you're right. The cat's out of the bag. It does, the only reaction there'd be to 1,000 African-American gun clubs popping up around the United States would be a massive spike in gun sales. And there would not be any laws, you wouldn't see the reaction that we saw with Reagan in California. So all that to say, I don't know how we turn from this without fixing our politics as well. I guess, we've been chatting a lot before we, go to questions and whatnot. It'd be great to hear a little bit from you in terms of, as a public health researcher, right? Justin and I come from a military background, and as gun owners, and so we look at it a very distinct way. Do you have any lessons for, is it the fight against tobacco? Is it the fight against obesity, right? All these really entangled health problems that we have. Is there an angle from the public health perspective that might help us break? Because me and Justin don't have the solution, clearly.
Well, I mean, we're all struggling with this, right? And I think one important thing to do to start to recognize is what we're doing here, which is that the terrain seems to have changed, right? So for people who know my work, I am now quite critical of the public health frame around guns. I think that it was important, but I think we made a mistake when we thought that it was similar to cigarettes or drunk driving. Cigarette manufacturers and car manufacturers, first of all, didn't have class action protection the way that the gun owners do. So you can't really sue a gun owner, which made them less amenable to those kind of critiques. But also, I personally feel like we have a real problem, right? Over 40,000 gun deaths a year in this country. But as people in the chat are pointing out, we have 393 million guns owned in this country, probably more than that. And so in a way, I think that the problem with the public health model is that it just focuses on the 40,000 and not the much bigger question, which is what you learn in the military, which is, what does it mean to be a gun owner, right? We kind of gave up that entire part of the thing until it's too late. And I also think there were some frame problems, right? In other words, even just to go back to the beginning of our conversation, what is a mass shooting? Well, initially we were just counting high profile things that made it onto the news, often with white shooters and white victims. It turned out when we started counting multiple victim gun homicides with 4 or more victims, there were about 10 times more than we recognized, because a lot of them were happening in South Chicago or South Nashville or other places, but we weren't counting Black victim shootings as part of this. And so the whole debate was not as diverse and expansive as it was. And so for me, the answer to this is just getting back to Jason's excellent point. This is a moment of coalition, right? We need to reimagine what's the broadest coalition we can build right now, because I think you're absolutely right that the problem we're seeing, it's a reflection of our politics. It's not just an isolated thing as much as we want it to be. This is a reflection of what we've learned in the pandemic, which is how can we or not come together to solve a common human problem? Injury and death, nobody wants it. How can we come together? But the inability to do so is what marks our politics, honestly, right now. And so I guess the issue is, let's fix the political issue, but part of it is reimagine the coalitions. I would gladly go into a coalition with you guys. And maybe 10 years ago, I wouldn't have said that or something like that. How can we come together? Because, I'm thinking of Justin's notion of common sense, which I agree with, except to say that, again, a lot of my friends who are way to the right of this, their position now is very emboldened. They think that the government, and there's no law, there's no possible law. The government has no right, there's no law, but they feel that way also because of vaccines and masks and things like that. So it's kind of like, thinking of the brilliant theorist Samar Ali, who says, how can we rebuild the public square? This is part of that. So Jason, is that a non-answer to your question?
No, I mean, well, there's no silver bullet, right? There's nothing that's gonna cut through this. So long as you have a divided polity, so long as you have people so disenfranchised with politics and fearful of the world that they think safety lies in a gun, we're not going to solve the gun problem. It's always amusing to me when people think that, well, and of course it's always a fantasy that they go back to, right? It's the John Wayne version of the history of the West, which is exceptionally cartoonish and a bit racialized, right? We wiped out the entirety of the people who did a lot of the work, which were Black cowboys. And anyway, another aside, right? It highlights the whole fantasy we created about the Wild West. And it's this idea that, well, if everybody's carrying a gun, then of course we're all going to just be more respectful to each other. And we're all going to get along fine, without realizing that we develop cultures and local laws over time because we knew what that could bring. And if you look at societies like Afghanistan, like Iraq, where there's no rule of law, everything's about force. And that's eventually where you go. That's eventually where you get. And the last thing I would say here for that part of it, to tie into where Black gun ownership comes in, I think there's a real reason you don't see a lot of Black gun clubs, because it's inviting counter violence, and that's been the history of armed minorities in America. And so there's a legacy of learning there that, hey, maybe we need to keep working this political thing, because a resort to arms is not going to end well for us particularly. Now the challenge is saying to white America, hey, a resort to arms, the only problem it solves is some weird fetishized fantasy of you being a superhero to make up for, whatever the dreariness of your daily existence might be.
Well, let me say, I'm getting the point here that we have about 2 minutes left before we let the excellent members of our audience solve this problem for us all in their breakout rooms. But I will say just 2 quick things. I mean, first of all, well, I'll tell you what, why don't we go around really quickly in 30 seconds or less. You're the president of the universe. What's your first step to move to address this? So why don't we go Justin, Jason, myself, and then we'll hand it back to the Q&A. Justin.
30 seconds to us. All right. Universal background checks. I think that should be my number one thing. I mean, the majority of Americans are for it. It doesn't make any sense why we don't have it. If you are purchasing a firearm from anyone, if there's a transfer of firearm from one person to another, there should be a background check, period. Permitless carry, nix it across the board. If you're carrying a weapon, you have to be trained and certified to carry that weapon. You cannot just throw it in your pocket and walk around. I think those are my two biggest things that come to mind. Like if I was president day one, like what I would, and I had the power of Congress behind me to actually enforce some of this.
All right. So we're going to do that. Jason, 30 seconds or less. What do you do?
A culture of accountability, right? Everybody wants power, but without the responsibility. Everybody wants to play tough, walk around with guns. We're at a point where somebody can leave a weapon out in their house, kids shoot themselves, and everybody sends thoughts and prayers. To me, that's negligent homicide. If not that, and I'm not a lawyer, but I don't want to hear thoughts and prayers for the parent who was so stupid that they let their kid kill themselves. So let's get a culture of accountability that says, oh, by the way, and you're also responsible for where your gun goes to a degree, right? If you hand it to a 17-year-old who's going to go up and participate in a very likely high threat, violent situation in the middle of massive protests, then there should be some accountability there as well for empowering a minor, right, by giving them the power to take life and death. So a culture of accountability that comes with power.
Cool.
Yeah,
And
just to actually touch on
go ahead.
Jason's accountability real quick, because I think one thing that we have failed to do is actually prosecute gun sellers for violating the law. I want to say the statistic that I read was about 5% roughly of FFLs, federal firearms licensed dealers, comprise selling, I want to say 90% of the guns used in crimes. However, I think today the incoming chair of the head of the ATF testified that only 1% of FFLs have ever lost their license for some type of negligence or violation of policy. So we're letting people sell guns that shouldn't even be selling guns. And I think that's another huge miss on our part. So that's my third thing. I know I went over 30 seconds, but I'll
That's good.
back to you, John.
You're right at 29 seconds. That's perfect. And I'll just say finally that I think we spend a lot of time arguing about what guns do and not enough about what guns mean, right? That's been so much of this conversation, right? So we should have open conversations about guns that aren't fired. What does it mean to carry a gun? I mean, I live in Tennessee. This is up in the chat. You can load it. You carry a loaded gun in a bar, no problem. Somebody's supposed to check. Good luck with that. What does that mean? What does it mean to carry a gun into a park? So I think in a way, the meaning of guns is really something we're going to have to reckon with because so much of this is like, when we're just arguing about mass shootings and stuff like that, then I think we're not getting at the bigger issue, which is about trust and community and mistrust. And certainly so much of this is about mistrust. I mean, wait till you see, I'll just say my last cynical thing and then I'll hand it to Mary, but wait till you see what happens to white gun ownership when a lot more Black men start carrying guns. It's going to be the best marketing tool they've ever had. And so, it's all about mistrusting other people. And I think that needs to be the conversation we need to have, not just about, because there's no policy that's going to fix that. That has to be a reckoning. So thank you, everybody. Thank you so much to our excellent two panelists. And now I will hand it back to Mary and Cameron to do the breakout room where people in the audience are going to solve this problem and get us on the path to righteousness.
Thank you all so much. So yeah, as Johnathan mentioned, we'll be moving into breakout groups where you can discuss this and then kind of strategies for engagement with your breakout group members. So Cameron will open up those groups and then you'll just get a notification if you could join. That would be great. Thank you. One second, we're having some technical issues. So you all cannot see a breakout room opening up, correct? Okay. Well, you know, we have only 11 people, so we might as well have the conversation here in this room, because otherwise it's going to be like even smaller than that. So Cameron, do you want to facilitate? Okay, awesome.
Yeah, sure. Let me just put this into gallery view so that I can see everyone who's here. All right. So just to kind of start out, we had some panelists in this event who each came from different backgrounds. We had Jason and Justin, who were from military backgrounds, both bringing their own perspectives. And then we had Johnathan, who's coming from more of an academic background, someone who studies things like gun violence and mental health. So what I wanted to ask you guys to consider is, how did they each engage in this conversation, while each kind of coming from different backgrounds and viewpoints that sort of informed their opinions and the facts that they shared about gun violence and gun culture? Or Jason, since I know that you're in the room right now, if you want to jump on and share how you experienced that conversation, what you learned from your fellow panelists, and in terms of both the points that they shared and the way that they shared them and engaged in dialogue.
Well, obviously, this is a deep, you know, there's 1,000 different places to take this conversation, which is, I think, part of the problem why we have a hard time getting traction on it from a policy level. Because there is the symbolic political nature around weapons, and then it goes all the way down to some of the work that a few of our folks on the call, notably Neil Hester and others, try to do to take it away from the high cultural debates just to, hey, what are you actually doing with the guns in your home, and can we be smarter about that? And so for me, I appreciate everybody sticking with it, because it's hard to balance both the really almost dominant role that guns now play in American culture with, you know, how do you talk about it as a tool? And so, Neil, why don't you kick us off with some group participation? Tell everybody a little bit about the work you've been doing, because I think it's worth hearing about.
Okay, I am also with Jason and Justin on the Veterans Advisory Council at Everytown, and we have these kinds of discussions among ourselves, and they're always interesting. I always learn something. But what I'm trying to do here I'm in Norman, Oklahoma, very red state with pretty loose firearms laws. And so I like to try to find a way to talk to gun owners. I am also a gun owner, by the way. And I like to encourage them to be responsible gun owners. Be the guy that, you know, the good guy with a gun that the NRA claims you are. And I don't mean by that the John Wayne guy that Jason is talking about. I just mean being responsible about who has access to your weapon. And if you're a responsible gun owner, people are going to be less likely to want to take your gun away from you. Being irresponsible with your gun is what makes people want to take your gun away from you. And so my conversations revolve around trying to keep children safe in the home that has firearms, by putting that responsibility on the firearm owner, not on the kid, and to keep those weapons safe from somebody who might want to steal them and do something untoward with them. I can't imagine somebody stealing a firearm from me and using it to kill anyone. It's just beyond my imagination. I don't know how I could handle that. So anyway, I just try to have that conversation that encourages people to be responsible with their firearms and be a responsible gun owner.
Go ahead, Bobby.
This has been excellent so far. Thank you. I happen to be sitting in a room with my husband, and we're not gun owners, and we're big gun control people, and a friend who is the opposite. And so as we've been listening to this, he's been making comments. And the comment that we both agreed on, I think it showed up in maybe in the chat and maybe in the conversation, was you have to have trust. My experience has been that when my friend Stan and I talk about any of these issues, if we start to exchange opinions, it doesn't go anywhere at all. If we start to talk about the other thing that was said, I think Summer put it in her chat, that fear leads to fantasy. It's some steps in between. That gets us some progress. So we're just interested in knowing what people think about avoiding the policy talks when you're talking with someone on the other side, so to speak, and just trying to build, he's saying common sense answers, and I'm saying trust, but anyway.
Those are great points. And I think, the part of the key to this is it's realizing that there isn't a dichotomy of gun owners and non-owners, right? And is Michael back now, or did he drop off? Mike, I don't know if he saw, he raised a very great point. For me to, I made some offhand comments about, the fetishized gun owners. And I will continue to call out, folks like Oath Keepers and 3%ers. And I think they do tie into both this really toxic blend of military fetishism and gun rights absolutism. But even framing the conversation there is difficult, right? Because I am a gun owner. My dad's a gun owner. Everybody I know is a gun owner practically. And so how do you have the question that moves those folks who aren't treating this as a cultural marker and get to some of the things that Neil Hester and Chris and Justin and others have talked about, where, if cat's out of the bag, we're not pulling in 400 million weapons. How do we all come to an agreement about how we decide we're going to use them and hold each other accountable for the power inherent in those weapons when we fail to either safeguard them or we put them and use them in ways that lead to unjust death?
All right, so just kind of to follow up from that, and I think that the panelists sort of touched on this right at the very end, is how can we take what was discussed in this event and start to, translate it into next steps? Like, how could we find approaches to finding solutions to some of the issues discussed today? If anyone wants to share on that.
Well, I think trusting one another, listening to one another, appreciating another person's point of view is important in being able to have a dialogue. Otherwise, it's circle up the wagons and start throwing bumper sticker slogans at each other, and we can all do that, and probably do on occasion, but that's not very productive in actually effecting change.
If I can, I'd like to make a brief comment as one of the probably seems to have few kind of pro-gun ownership people on this. I think one thing that would help me is that getting some honesty into this and getting an understanding of some of the underlying facts and some of the underlying issues around this. there have been a number of things, even brought up on this conversation that are great talking points and make for great sound bites, but aren't factually accurate. And I think that if you don't start with facts, and we all have a shared sense of those, it becomes difficult. And yeah, I did make the comment about about Jason and talking about fetishizing gun owners, because it's really hard to have a good, reasonable conversation when it's perfectly acceptable to say you're racist because you believe in open carry, or you have a gun fetish because you choose to carry a gun. That makes it's very, very difficult to have a conversation, a meaningful conversation with people, when you immediately get attacked in those manners. So that would help me.
Christine, I see your hand up.
One of the things I was curious about is, so Vermont, it has been getting some attention lately because it always gets listed as being an open carry state, which it is, but it also in the last few years has passed some restrictions on, having to be 21 to purchase certain things, eliminating bump stocks, certain magazines. They have a red flag law that's pretty strong. And I happened to be in the House during that, in Vermont, visiting during that discussion. And I was just really struck by the respectfulness of folks in that space, the kind of conversations that they had. I mean, Vermont obviously is a very small state and rural state, but it's so remarkably different from other small rural states. And I'm just curious about the ways in which we learn from places that do it differently. I don't know that we do a very good job of that. And I think we need to think through, and they pulled, some of the sponsors pulled legislation that they realized was going too far or just didn't have the support yet. And one of the things that really struck me at the time, because it was not something I had thought about, this is a few years ago very much, was a lot of the support was coming because of suicide. Not because of, it was not, one of the preempting kind of events was a planned for mass shooting at a high school, somebody who was a young man who was planning for that, and that kind of prompted a lot of it. But most of the kind of votes that came from more conservative quarters were from folks motivated by suicide, particularly the age restrictions on gun purchases. So again, it was just a conversation that was very, to my perspective, and that's just one person, but very respectful and really engaged, and did not demonize gun ownership. And in fact, a lot of the sponsors of the bills were gun owners. So just think, like, finding where those conversations have already happened in substantive ways. And I know Vermont's very different from a lot of places, but that doesn't mean that we can't learn from them. So it's just a thought around that. I just thought the irony is that they keep on saying, well, Vermont's an open carry state, which it is, because that law has worked for them and their culture, but it doesn't get very deep into the complexity of that place. So just a thought.
So to kind of build off of what Michael was saying before, is there anything that y'all think was missing from this conversation? Anything that you would have appreciated that the panelists had done, or that you had been able to, hear discuss, that you thought was missing?
If I may, I think from my perspective, and I think Justin touched on this briefly, but coming in from a perspective of an immigrant family who is pro-Second Amendment, but yet the fear of immigrants, specifically Muslim immigrants, who know they have the right to carry arms and know that they're entitled to Second Amendment, but yet fear to do so because of the criminalization that they face. And that laws are applied unfairly at times to our community, and how that has impacted our community, who could potentially, I come from a family who survived genocide. And so the traumas of leaving a government who sanctioned genocide on you resonates, and that trauma is forever embedded in us. And then you come to a country where freedom and opportunity is given, and you want to partake, and you have these rights, but you're constantly afraid of being recriminalized. And I think, Justin talked about the African American community and the fear of carrying and things of that. And I totally, that resonates with me as a Muslim, as someone who's, father and brother who carry in every day the fear of what if they're pulled over, what if something happens, what if their rights are taken away. And so these are, I think that perspective as well is something that I'd like to highlight in this conversation.
Yeah, definitely. And I see Christine was sharing about this, and then Michael also shared in the chat about how the majority of gun deaths are from suicides. I know that I remember Jason has actually talked about this and about gun suicides being an issue, especially with people who are military or ex-military. Jason, if you wanted to share a little bit more about that.
The last stats, we've lost well over 50,000 people since 2001 to suicide, majority of them with guns. I'd have to pull up I gotta figure out the date on that. But when you talk about veteran suicide, it's about 13 times the number of veterans or the number of military folks that we lost in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so talking about that in a responsible way is tough. But again, it's hard to have those conversations when anybody says, well, hey, maybe we need to look at, right, do we even issue or ask manufacturers, right, as part of a package, much like you get brakes on your car, right? We can't even mandate, hey, here's a gun lock with your new gun. Here's a way to store it properly. The impulsive nature of guns have the highest rate of effective suicide by far. And because veterans are familiar with them and often have access to them, it results in something very unfortunate. And so, particularly us in the veteran community, it's how do we grapple with that, knowing that, hey, again, we all have guns and nobody's saying that we don't want our other veterans to have guns. But what are some ways to look at it from a public health perspective where every argument is not shut down by, well, if you suggest that, you're trying to take away everybody's guns. And that's the difficulty in addressing that. I'm wondering, we have Chris on here. Chris Marvin, do you have, want to put you on the spot because you've done a lot of work here as well in terms of addressing that.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. I mean, I was just underlining what you were saying. You're nailing them. I'm just putting the stats in the chat for everybody. But the one I just put in is that 68% of veteran suicides are by gun, compared to 48% of non-veteran suicides. And as you alluded, like veterans are, as you stated, veterans are much more likely to own guns. I believe it's something like 45% of veterans own guns versus 20% of non-veterans. And so what you see is, you see the proliferation of gun ownership amongst veterans, and then leads to, in sort of a suicidal ideation, leads to the use of the firearm, which of course is 90 to 95% effective compared to 5% effective for all other means of suicide combined. A gun suicide attempt is a death. A non-gun suicide attempt is a suicide attempt that sometimes leads to death, and many, many more times than not does not. So really, we can talk about mental health, it's all important, but if we don't get in front of the gun, we don't have time for the mental health and the peer support and the substance abuse counseling that a veteran or a civilian might need to prevent that suicide. And for us, we're just working really hard to try to get certainly the past administration and Department of Veterans Affairs, and even the current administration and Department of Veterans Affairs, to say the word gun when they talk about veteran suicide. They like to use the word lethal means because it covers everything, and they don't say gun. Meanwhile, or firearm. Meanwhile, when 70% of veteran suicides are by gun, how can you ignore it, right? And that's obviously really, really frustrating and impacts policy. But that's what we're dealing with. Like if we can separate a veteran in crisis from his or her gun by any means, we can give them the time to get the help they need to prevent the suicide, prevent that impulsive act.
All right, so kind of building off of that, a couple people have shared sort of what they see the broader next steps sort of in this conversation and what needs to happen in order to solve certain problems that keep coming up. So what I want to ask is, what must happen in addition to dialogue? Like, what are some concrete steps that organizations, individuals, policymakers can take that you believe would contribute to solving the problems that have been discussed today? Doesn't even have to be like concrete policies or anything.
Yeah, I think this was discussed a little bit earlier, prosecuting some of the, heavily prosecuting some of the laws that are already in effect. Straw man purchases are rampant in many, many cities. They are almost never prosecuted by federal prosecutors, right? And I don't know, there's probably reasons, but they just don't hit them. They don't hit the individuals. I'm sure there are difficulties with some of these FFLs, and I'm sure that there's should be some prosecution around some of the FFLs too. But what if all these people, all these background checks that come back where people get denied, right? And there are a reasonable number. Why aren't authorities walking up to that person? Because you've given them your driver's license, you've written your address in it, you've written your phone number in it, they've checked all your information, they know exactly where you are. Why aren't they knocking on the door to that person's house and prosecuting people for attempting to purchase a firearm when they are legally disallowed from purchasing it? It's a great first step. Let's use the laws that are on the books today.
This is a much broader perspective, and maybe not something that is, an easy next step to take, but I think something that's important to think about, in securing a sense of trust and a feeling of safety in our communities so that folks do not feel the need to heavily arm themselves to support their safety and to support their rights. What are we doing to address the inequities within our own societies that are emphasizing this fear and feeling of not having safety? I think Johnathan mentioned, the NRA tactic of appealing towards women who are afraid of, being under threat of violence in the streets. Ramzia mentioned, state-sanctioned, ethnic prosecution. There's many different things that people are very fearful of right now and feeling unsafe in our society. So how are we addressing those things through our policy and through our conversation and through our community action in a way that supports a long-standing sense of safety and security and trust within our communities?
Yeah, and I think it was Mladen who shared before in the chat about how entrepreneurial politicians often utilize certain talking points or certain facts or data in order to mobilize people towards acting against their own interests and to vote for people based not necessarily on their reality that they're living, but on things that certain politicians are are telling them. So I don't know if you want to share more on that, Loudon, if you're still on, or if anyone else kind of wants to speak to the points that Elise shared.
I feel like, and this kind of stems towards a little bit, like my background being in the Kurdish community or also the immigrant community, is pushing the safety aspect of it in the midst of these inequities and things like that. And in the midst of, you can't really control people's anxieties and how they react to it, is noting that what safety aspects could be done and could be trained and could be just communicated towards those populations to say, like, if this is the route you decide to go down, how can we ensure that you know how to handle it safely, you know how to like store it safely, and make sure that like we at least minimize as much as possible the violence that could come as a result.
And so kind of similar to what Shun just shared. What lessons from your own life do you have to share with the group regarding this issue? Because I think that our opinions on issues such as this are often shaped by our own experiences in many ways and our own values. And I think it would be interesting to kind of share where our perspectives on this are coming from, whether that's specific life events, whether that's research that we've done or anything like that, so that we can sort of try to identify a common thread. I know that we're all coming from probably different perspectives on this issue, but I think it would be interesting to explore where those perspectives come from and where we can share them in common. Sorry about that.
I can tell you mine, and that's just I'm part of a culture that does not value gun ownership. I don't know very many people who have guns other than a few that keep them in their home. I have never been able to understand the rationale behind permitless carry and open carry. It makes just no logical sense to me, other than to protect God-given rights to own a gun. I don't like living in a community where there's open carry and permitless carry. And I don't know why we sell guns that have tremendous potential to cause great harm. Why do we sell assault rifles at all?
I'll jump on that one and just say, to kind of repeat what Avi said there, but also give my perspective. My perspective comes from military service, right? And Jason and Justin both talked about training, safety, and accountability, which are, by all accounts, the three pillars of military gun culture, and is what makes it a functional gun culture. And of course, as veterans, we come back into civilian gun culture. Most of us are just astounded at the laws and lack of laws and loopholes that just the difference between the profession of arms that we experience in uniform and sort of the collection of laws that exist throughout this country. But Anthony Swafford, who wrote the book Jarhead, wrote a really great op-ed in the Des Moines Register opposing open carry in Iowa, and the permitless carry and the repeal of background checks in Iowa. And those did pass, and the governor signed them. But he was just talking about the fact that he loved Iowa, he'd lived there, he'd been there, he'd studied there, and next time he went back, he wouldn't feel safe. And I think that's exactly what Avi said too, because he knew when he was in the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, that every person around him who was carrying their firearm was trained. They were trained, they were safe, and they were accountable for what happened with their weapon. And today, you can't know that. You can't know that person who has a gun on their hip, knows anything about the gun. They could have literally just bought it at Walmart in some states and put it on their hip. And how can anybody feel safe, right? Even the most responsible gun owner who supports all of these laws, how can they feel safe looking at the least common denominator, right? Their crazy neighbor, or that weird person that they see at the store sometimes. And not to judge anybody, but knowing that like these laws are for the least common denominator, right? Think of the most irresponsible person you know in your life. Do you want him or her going to Walmart, buying a gun and strapping it on their hip and walking through a grocery store? Like, absolutely not. And that's why the military's perspective, we just think that that's ridiculous. It's just crazy that we would let people hold guns in that fashion.
I also think there needs to be a little bit of a reality check in terms of what is a gun going to protect you from? There's always this idea that, I'll be the one to stop the shooting. I'll be the one to save somebody's life. And the reality and the messiness with which incidents like that unfold, having every single person, if you think of, one person running amok through a mall, you say, well, if everybody's armed, we'll take care of them quick. If everybody's armed, odds are a lot more people are going to get killed really quick. One of the most frightening places I've ever been is, in a chow hall overseas where everybody's been trained with a weapon, but you've got 300 people in there all eating lunch, heavily armed. And you think, man, I hope, a mortar doesn't hit or somebody tries to get in, because 300 people trying to unscrew themselves, and everybody carrying a weapon is just a recipe for a lot of people dying needlessly. So I think a little bit of training, a little bit of background checks can maybe dispel people, or at least some kind of cultural reminder that this is really powerful. This is not something that's going to instantly turn you into a hero. And statistically, it's much more likely something that's going to lead to someone's tragic death if not handled responsibly. And that's all we're asking for, I think, from the veteran perspective is, take your weapons, but let's look at background checks. Let's look at least, maybe a little bit of wait time before you walk out of the shop with your weapon. Because if you're in that much hurry for a weapon, you're probably not using it for the most kind of calm reasons. So I think there's a lot of little things we can do to reinforce what's good about gun culture, and mitigate some of the negative effects.
Yeah, and I kind of want to sort of jump off of what both of you were saying. To Michael, I know in the chat earlier you shared about how there can be a barrier to access for gun training, especially for people who are low income. And I think that you threw out an idea about having that subsidized. If you could share a little bit more on that.
Yeah, my only concern around when you start to put a lot of requirements on, being able to exercise, a constitutional right, whether it's the First Amendment, Second Amendment, Fourth Amendment, or regardless of what it is, you suddenly create some barriers for people. Now, when I wanted to go get my concealed carry permit, I had to do 8 hours of classroom training. I had to go shoot targets, buy ammo and, do all that stuff. Pretty easy for me, right? My job was such that it was pretty easy for me to take off a couple hours early from work and go head over there for a 4-hour trip in the evening. Not so much for everybody else. So, if we're going to go down that path where you're going to require some of these things, I think you in some ways need to start looking at how do you subsidize some of this so that we can have some equity. Elise, I think, very rightly talked about equity earlier, and there are real problems. Most of those problems are because we keep putting new laws in place that make it harder and harder for people. And they always, 100% of the time, affect those who are on the lowest income levels the most, 100% of the time. And in our country, that also ends up hitting a lot of minorities. But primarily, this is about income inequality and income differences. And if you're not going to take both of those on, it's difficult. And just to clear something up, I'm former military. Army infantry, served in the first Gulf War, in a combat unit. So, I respect and get everything you guys are saying. I think I had a little different view because I had some pretty stupid people in my infantry unit that I'm not sure I wanted them to have guns. But you know what? That's that's part of it, right? And there's some really good statistics out there if you care to look them up around legal gun owners, those with concealed carry permits, being some of the most law-abiding citizens in this country, being 8 to 10 times less likely to commit a felony or a crime with a firearm than a law enforcement officer. And that's in spite of the blue wall, right? That we know law enforcement officers protect each other. And even with that, your legal gun owners tend to be far more law-abiding than your general citizen, in this country. And so let's look at laws that keep people who are not the legal gun owners from getting them. And so when we start to talk about some of these, universal background check laws, some of these are more largely impacting enthusiasts, collectors, things along those lines. So I don't know that they're making a big impact in in suicides. And I don't know that they're going to make a big impact in a lot of the crime that goes on, where most of these, a lot of the homicides that you have in highly populated cities that end up creating, the vast majority of the gun violence in this country.
Right. And I think that we're having a great discussion here, so I hate to cut it off, but we are right at the end of our event here. So I just want to say thank you to everyone for attending. Thank you for engaging and staying to discuss with us. And thank you very much to our panelists. I think Jason's the last one on here, but thank you to all of them for, guiding us through this discussion and allowing us to enter into dialogue with them. So, all right, we'll close out there, but thank you all again for coming.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.